The motel room smelled like bleach and burnt toast. I remember the flickering light bulb over the sink. The way the sheets felt damp even though they were folded. And her perfume. Sharp, floral, choking the air, lingering like a slap I hadn't seen coming. She set my suitcase down, not near the bed, just inside the door. "You'll be fine for a few days," she said, adjusting her sunglasses. Then she looked at her nails. Not at me. "Don't open the door to strangers. Lock it from the inside." I didn't speak. I couldn't. My voice was jammed somewhere between my throat and my stomach. She handed me a folded 20. "Order a pizza or something. You like pepperoni, right?" Her smile was too bright. Her heels clicked as she walked away. I waited for her to turn back. She didn't. From the window, I watched her slide into the back of a Silvertown car. Luggage stacked neatly in the trunk. And beside her, a man I'd only met twice, and his 2 daughters already calling her Mom. That word used to be mine. The car pulled away. I remember blinking so hard it hurt. "My name is Emily," and that was the day I learned that some people don't forget you. They choose to leave you behind. I was 15. No phone. No ID. $32 in my backpack. And a silence in my chest so loud, I thought it might shatter something permanent. You don't forget a moment like that. You bury it. You raise a daughter of your own and promise she will never feel it. But 30 years later, she came back. Not to say sorry. Not to ask for forgiveness, but for help. And I was the only one who could give it. Or refuse. Would you have answered her call? Would you fight back or walk away? Where are you listening from? Has anyone ever left you behind like that? It's been nearly 3 decades, but I still hesitate when someone knocks on a motel door in movies. That metallic click, that pause, that silence before danger or kindness walks in. I lived in that silence for 3 days. After she left, I stayed frozen in the motel room for at least 2 hours, too scared to move, too ashamed to cry out loud. I remember counting the tiles on the bathroom floor just to hear something other than my thoughts. The TV didn't work. The phone had a cord but no dial tone. My dinner was a bag of trail mix I found in my backpack. At night, I pulled the thin blanket over my head and tried to pretend I was camping. That helped until I started shaking from the cold. On the second morning, I ventured out to the front desk and asked the man there if I could use the phone. He didn't ask why. Maybe he knew. Maybe he'd seen too many girls like me. I dialed the number my mother had written in shaky pen on the motel notepad. "If something happens," she'd said, "call this." It rang twice. And then a voice I hadn't heard in years, "Emily." It was my grandmother. She arrived 6 hours later with a station wagon and a thermos of cocoa. She hugged me without asking questions. That's when I first learned that real love doesn't need explanations. Growing up with her after that felt like trying to repair a house during a thunderstorm. She did everything she could to make me feel safe. But the cracks were there. Trust doesn't rebuild itself just because someone else is kinder. Still, she gave me my first real bed, with soft blue sheets and a pillow that smelled like lavender. She always left the hallway light on. And every morning, she'd ask, "Are you warm enough?" I wasn't. Not for years. I don't talk much about those years. Not with friends. Not with coworkers. Not even with my daughter, Leela. She knows my mom moved away when I was young. That's the line I've used since Leela was old enough to ask. And every time I say it, I feel the lie settle somewhere in my bones. But how do you explain to a child that you weren't chosen? That you were a burden someone gladly set down? I work at a private hospital in Denver now. Administrative side, insurance verification, intake coordination, end-of-life paperwork. It's not glamorous, but it pays the bills. And it gives me routine. I like routine. Coffee at 6:30, traffic down 6th Avenue. Elevator to the 3rd floor. Quiet greetings with the security guard who always smells like peppermint gum. My desk is plain. One framed picture of Leela at the zoo, holding a balloon. A sticky note that reads, "You are the calm." That's who I try to be. The calm one. The one who doesn't let her past bleed into her present. But it's hard, especially when the hospital corridors echo with things I've tried to forget. Sobs behind closed doors. Whispers of families falling apart. People begging for help, or worse, people asking for help from someone who cannot give it. Leela is 13 now. Smart. Sensitive. She writes poetry she never shows anyone and leaves folded napkins by the sink when she's worried about me. Last week, she asked me, "Did your mom used to tuck you in like you do for me?" I hesitated, then lied. "Sometimes," I said. It came out quieter than I meant. She nodded, satisfied. But later that night, when I kissed her forehead, she opened her eyes and whispered, "I'm glad you're not like her." I stood in the hallway afterward for a long time. Because the truth is, every day, I try not to be. That's the thing about having a parent who abandoned you. You either become them, or you become the opposite. There's no middle ground. For years, I kept everything small and manageable. No risks, no sudden moves. I didn't even travel more than 2 hours outside Denver. I told myself it was to save money, but deep down, I think I was still afraid. Afraid that if I went too far from home, someone might not let me come back. When Nancy disappeared into that Paris honeymoon, she didn't just leave me. She erased me. She built a new life, a new identity, a new family. And she never reached out again. Not a birthday card. Not a letter. Nothing. Until recently. But I'll get to that. Because before her message came, there was a stretch of time where I genuinely forgot she existed. Or maybe I just got really good at pretending. Because healing doesn't come with a date stamp. And closure doesn't knock politely. Sometimes, it shows up as a file on your work computer, with a name you haven't spoken in 28 years. It started like any other Monday. The copier jammed before 9 a.m. Karen from payroll was already complaining about the break room coffee. The halls smelled faintly of disinfectant and reheated soup. I had 3 intake files flagged for urgent review before noon. It wasn't until 10:42 that my day derailed. I was in the back-end system, verifying Medicaid eligibility for a patient flagged as out of state but urgent. I clicked open the file, and there it was. Saunders, Nancy 8OBO5511 1959 Denver County Assistance Request Emergency Medical Subsidy Relationship, no known immediate family or support system. My hand froze on the mouse. That name, that birth date, that lie. I felt the air go tight around me. My stomach twisted so fast I thought I might be sick right there at my desk. But I didn't move. Didn't breathe. She was here. Not physically, but in the system. In my system. I double-checked the file 3 times. Her face wasn't in the photo ID. Just a scan of her driver's license, slightly faded. But I didn't need to see it. That handwriting on the intake form. I'd seen it before. On Motel stationery in 1996. Call this number if something happens. She was applying for state aid through our hospital's financial branch. Claiming to have no family. No support. No one. And I was the one who received the file. I stood up, walked to the bathroom, and locked the door behind me. Sat on the closed toilet lid and stared at the cracked tile. What was I supposed to do? Forward it? Flag it? Call someone? Tell them what? That the woman asking for help once left me alone with a motel vending machine and a $20 bill. I splashed cold water on my face and leaned over the sink. The lights in there always buzzed. A low hum that made everything sound like it was coming from underwater. Was this a coincidence? A mistake? No, it was real. Nancy Saunders had returned, not to find me, not to say sorry, but because she needed something. Back at my desk, I stared at the screen for a long time. Her file sat open. Her words stared back. No next of kin. No children. No one. That part didn't hurt. It enraged me. After everything, she still chose the lie. Still chose to erase me. But this time, I wasn't 15. And she wasn't in control. That night, I didn't sleep much. I sat in the kitchen after Lila went to bed, the dishwasher humming softly behind me. My tea went cold. I didn't drink it. I opened my laptop, pulled up the hospital login, and reread the file. I thought about the lavender pillow my grandmother gave me. About how long it took to sleep without fear. I thought about the folded 20. about how it didn't even cover the motel room for 2 nights. And I thought about Lila, tucked in upstairs, safe, a girl who'd never once wondered if her mother loved her. Nancy had made her choices, and now I had one to make. The next morning, I told my supervisor I needed to reassign a file. Personal conflict, I said. She didn't ask, she just nodded. That's the beauty of working around grief all day. People learn when not to pry. But I didn't delete the file. I printed it, folded it in half, slipped it into my bag next to Leela's signed permission slip for her school trip. Life moves like that sometimes, the most sacred and the most bitter. Tucked side by side in a nylon tote. I drove past the post office after work. I didn't mean to, but my hands turned the wheel on instinct. I parked, walked in, bought a plain manila envelope and a forever stamp. No return address. Just her name. And inside, the full copy of the intake form. And one more thing. I reached into my bottom drawer that night. The one I never let Leela open. Pulled out an old envelope. Inside it was a photo I had kept for years. Franny. A snapshot of a motel sign just outside Kansas City. Silver Maple Lodge weekly rates available. It was taken the morning I left with my grandmother. I'd taken it on a disposable camera she kept in her purse. I hadn't meant to keep it, but somehow I always had. I slipped the photo inside the envelope. No note, no message, no warning, just proof. She'd erased me from her forms. So I gave her back a piece of what she discarded. 2 days later, I got a message from Karen at the front desk. Someone named Nancy called. Didn't leave a callback number. Said she needed to speak to the one who sent it. You know what that's about? I nodded slowly. I think I do. That night, I watched Leela doing homework across the table. She looked up, confused by my stare. Do I have something on my face? I smiled. No, baby. You're perfect. She grinned, flicked a pencil shaving at me. Mom, you're acting weird. I stood, kissed the top of her head. I just needed to see you. I whispered, because I knew what was coming next. Nancy wouldn't disappear this time. She'd push. She'd demand. She always did. And for the first time since I was 15, I wasn't afraid to push back. The voicemail came on a Wednesday. I had just finished reviewing a hospice transfer when my desk phone lit up. Unknown caller, 2 new messages. I listened to the first tain spam. The second made my blood freeze. A voice I hadn't heard since I was a child. Clipped. Polished. Still pretending to care without actually sounding like she did. Emily, I assume it was you who sent that envelope. I recognized the photo. A pause. I'd like to talk, it's important. Call me. She left no number, just silence, and that name. My name, spoken like a formality. That night I lay in bed staring at the ceiling fan. Leela had fallen asleep early. I'd made pasta. She said it was too garlicky, but ate 2 helpings anyway. The house was quiet. Too quiet. I got up, opened the drawer again. The one with the envelope now gone, but other things remained. An old bus ticket from Kansas City to Boulder. A hospital bracelet with my name misspelled. And the motel receipt. Crumpled, ink faded. I stared at the total, 42,000. She left me with 32, not even enough to stay the night legally. That detail never stopped bothering me. When I was 15, I waited 2 full days before I called my grandmother. Not because I thought my mom would come back. I knew she wouldn't. But I kept hoping she'd call the motel, check in. Pretend she cared. She didn't. The motel clerk, Mr. Henry, I still remember his name. He let me use the lobby phone without asking questions. Even gave me a sandwich from the break room fridge. I hadn't spoken to anyone in 48 hours. When my grandmother answered, I didn't even cry. I just said, she left. And Grandma whispered, I'm coming. That was all. She drove 7 hours through snow to get me. The morning after Nancy's voicemail, I wore lipstick to work for the first time in months. Not for vanity, for armor. Karen from payroll raised an eyebrow. Big meeting today? No, I said. Bigger memory. That afternoon the call came through again. This time to my cell. Unknown number. I stepped into the stairwell. Cool concrete. Echoes of fluorescent hum and pressed answer. Hello. Emily? Her voice, less steady now. Yes? A pause. I didn't expect to hear from you. I wasn't sure if you even remembered. I laughed. A short, cold sound. Believe me, I remember. Another silence. Then, look, I know how this probably seems. I cut her off. It seems like you're asking for help without acknowledging what you did. I was young. She snapped, suddenly defensive. I had no choice. That trip was more important than your child. My voice was calm. I was proud of that. You don't understand. I was alone. That marriage was my second chance. No, I said quietly. I was your second chance, she exhaled. That was a long time ago. 30 years, I said. You haven't called. Written. Nothing. Not one birthday. Not one apology. I thought it would be better if I stayed away, cleaner. For you. I nearly dropped the phone. Cleaner. She thought erasing me was a kindness. People assume closure comes with screaming. But it doesn't. Sometimes, it comes with hearing someone twist history until it snaps, and realizing you no longer need their version of it. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I let her talk about her divorce, her money problems, how she had no one left. And then came the ask. I need help. The medical debt, it's too much. I was told someone at your hospital, maybe you, could expedite things. Just a small adjustment. A code, maybe. I felt my stomach turn. That's what I was to her, a shortcut. You listed no family on your application, I said slowly. Was that a mistake? Her breath caught. I thought it was easier. Easier, like I was an inconvenience at 15. And still one at 40, too. You should talk to billing. I told her, they handle those cases. Emily, please. Her voice cracked, just a little. But it didn't move me. I already did my part, I said. I sent the photo. You know who I am. That's more than I ever got from you. Then I hung up. The stairwell echoed as I walked back to my desk. My reflection in the window looked older than I remembered. But stronger too. Karen passed by, holding a sandwich. You okay? I nodded. Just got off the phone with a ghost. That night, I sat with Lila while she painted her nails. She picked sky blue. I want something calm, she said. I smiled. You already are. She looked up. You're being weird again, Mom. I laughed, and didn't explain. Because some days, being weird means surviving something invisible. When I was 17, I sat in a courthouse and changed my last name. It wasn't dramatic. No slammed doors, no public confrontation. Just me, my grandmother, and a clerk with a short haircut and tired eyes. She looked over the paperwork, glanced at me, then stamped it. Saunders to Macadams, she asked. I nodded. My grandmother's name. The clerk smiled gently. It suits you better. And that was it. I became Emily McAdams. I left Nancy behind on paper, long before I knew how to do it in my heart. But the heart is slower than the law. Even now, sometimes when I fill out forms for Leela and C, mother's maiden name, I hesitate. My pen lingers. Not because I don't remember, but because I don't know which woman it belongs to anymore. The one who raised me, or the one who left. That week, after the phone call, I kept expecting her to show up, to call again, to write, to twist things one more time. But silence stretched on. It should have felt like peace. Instead, it felt like pressure. Like standing inside a house with the windows closed and waiting for the wind to break in anyway. Leela noticed. Of course she did. You're humming again, she said one night while setting the table. I looked up. What? You always hum when something's wrong. I hadn't realized. It was an old tune. A lullaby my grandmother used to sing when my nightmares woke the house. I smiled at her. Maybe it's just stuck in my head. She narrowed her eyes, not buying it. But she let it go. That's the thing about raising a sensitive kid. She sees through you even when you're trying to protect her. That night, after she fell asleep, I sat at the kitchen table with the lights low. I opened my journal. A gift from Carla last Christmas. It still smelled faintly like ink and leather. And I wrote just one question. If she were your daughter, would you forgive her? I stared at the sentence for a long time, then underlined, daughter. Because that's what made this harder than I wanted to admit. It wasn't just about Nancy. It was about Leela. What if one day, my daughter left? What if she got angry, ran away, changed her name? Would I want a second chance? But then, another part of me spoke up. You didn't forget your child. You didn't leave her alone in a rented room with no food. You didn't pretend she didn't exist. So no, this isn't the same. Still, it haunted me. I found myself rereading old emails, scrolling through pictures of Leela as a baby, as a toddler, as a third grader missing her front teeth. Each photo said you stayed, you showed up. You did what she didn't. But grief doesn't care about logic. It just curls up in the corners of your mind and waits for a moment to whisper. One afternoon, I walked by the social services office at work, paused. There was a flyer on the wall. Family Reconciliation Services, because it's never too late to reconnect. The print was faded. The photo showed a mother hugging a grown daughter. I stared at it longer than I meant to. Then tore it down and threw it in the trash. That night, Leela asked if we could make pancakes for dinner. We did, with chocolate chips. She burned the first one and laughed so hard she hiccuped. When we sat down to eat, she looked at me, serious. Did you ever feel like you didn't belong anywhere? The question landed like a stone in my chest. Yes, I said. I did, for a long time. She nodded slowly, then reached across the table and took my hand. You do now. Just so you know. My throat tightened. I squeezed her fingers and whispered, I do now, too. That night, I knew one thing for certain. Nancy had made her choices, and no amount of guilt, blood, or shared last names would ever undo what she'd left behind. The next envelope didn't come from her. It came from her attorney, a firm in Boulder I'd never heard of, name printed in embossed black font, too elegant for the contents inside. The letter was 3 pages long. Cold. Formal. Carefully crafted to sound both desperate and threatening. Nancy was emotionally distressed. She claimed I had maliciously interfered with her access to rightful support. She listed past trauma as a reason for unintentional parental absence. And then, she asked for mediation through the state, not to reconcile, to gain access, to demand help. I laughed out loud. The sound echoed in my apartment like it didn't belong to me. That night, I stayed up late, not out of fear, but out of strategy. I poured a glass of ginger ale, pulled up my work laptop, logged into the encrypted financial portal. I hadn't done anything unethical. I hadn't altered her case. I had only refused to fix it. Still, I knew I had to protect myself. So I documented everything, every date, every form, every voicemail. I built a timeline that couldn't be twisted, just in case. The next day, I met with HR. Is this a legal threat against you or the hospital? My supervisor asked. Technically me, I said. But I wanted you to know. She read the letter, raised an eyebrow. That's her mother. I nodded. She's not in any of our emergency contact systems, she noted. She made sure of that, I said. Then I handed her the full printout of the file. I didn't approve or deny anything. I stepped back. She looked me in the eye. You did everything by the book. That was all I needed to hear. Back home, I called Carla. She answered on the first ring. What happened now? I read her the letter. There was silence. Then a long, low whistle. Wow, she said. She really has some nerve. I nodded. Though she couldn't see me, she wants access to me, my records, my life. Again. Carla exhaled. What are you going to do? I walked to the kitchen window, watched the snow fall softly on the porch railing. I'm going to protect what I built. That's all. Later that week, Leela was drawing at the dining table. Mum, she asked, what does legacy mean? I blinked. Where'd you hear that word? In a poem. It said, we are more than our pain. We are our legacy. She paused. Is that true? I sat beside her. It can be, if you decide what to leave behind. She tilted her head. Like what you leave to me. I looked at her drawing. A small house. A garden. 2 figures holding hands. Yes, I whispered. Exactly like that. That weekend I opened a new email account. Not for myself. For Nancy. I drafted a reply to the attorney. Subject proposed mediation for financial conflict. Thank you for your correspondence. The individual in question is not a dependent, spouse, or legal guardian of mine. She is not listed on any record relevant to my employment, benefits, or medical directives. Any further attempt to claim connection or legal obligation will be treated as harassment. Attached are documented communications for reference. Respectfully, E. McAdams. I hit send. Then shut the laptop with a click that sounded like closure. But I wasn't done. I pulled out a small fireproof lockbox from my closet. Inside, my updated will, Leela's trust paperwork, a letter I had written but never sent, to Nancy. I unfolded it. Read the first line. I survived. That's all you need to know. I smiled. Then burned it. Because she didn't deserve that version of me anymore. I began planning next steps. I updated my own emergency contacts, filed an addendum to the HR database, removed any lingering ties to the name, Saunders. I booked an appointment with a legal advocate. Just to be sure. Not out of fear, but because self-protection is not revenge, it's legacy. The final straw came a week later. A handwritten card in my mailbox. The handwriting was unmistakable. Inside, you can still fix this. One call, one signature. You owe me that much. No, love. No, I'm sorry. Just a demand. Like nothing had changed. I didn't cry. I didn't tear it up. I took a photo of it. Then filed it in a folder labeled, "For when she says it never happened." I don't want to destroy her. But I won't let her rewrite this. Because for years I carried her silence like a weight. Now she'll carry my boundary like a wall, and I'll keep building my life brick by brick behind it. With Leela beside me. Not with shame, but with clarity. Have you ever had to protect yourself from someone who once called you family? Let me know below. Your story might help someone find their voice too. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more true stories of quiet justice, closure, and emotional legacy after 40. There's something sacred about a locked drawer, not because of what it hides, but because of what you finally choose to protect. Mine held exactly 3 things: Leela's birth certificate, my grandmother's last handwritten grocery list, and a printed copy of the notarized advance medical directive I'd signed 6 years ago. No mention of Nancy. No loopholes. No, in case of reconciliation, language. It was time to make sure the system saw what I already knew. That my life belonged to me, not to the woman who walked away from it. The next day, I met with the hospital's legal advisor. Her office smelled like citrus cleaner and ink. A tiny plant sat by the window, half thriving. I just want to document this properly, I said. No ambiguity. If she pushes again, I need it to be airtight. She nodded. You're allowed to set boundaries. Even with family. Especially with family, I said. We reviewed every form, every emergency contact, every code linking me to her name. We cleared them all. Updated passwords. Set alerts for any future attempts to use my credentials as access. It wasn't revenge. It was security, and it felt good. Later that week, I picked Leela up from school. She climbed into the car, cheeks flushed from the wind. There was a paint smear on her jeans and glitter in her hair. Art day, she explained, buckling her seatbelt. Miss Tonya says I have a reckless color instinct. That's good, right? It's the best, I said, grinning. We stopped for milkshakes. Chocolate for her. Coffee, flavored for me. She slurped hers loudly and leaned her head on my shoulder. I hope I never make you sad, she said quietly. I looked down at her. You won't, I whispered. You were the reason I figured out what happy even meant. That night I typed a new document. A letter, not for Nancy, but for Leela to be opened when she turns 18. It began. You were never a burden, not for 1 second. And it told the truth. Not the story of abandonment, but the story of rebuilding, of strength, of boundaries, of choosing what to carry forward. I printed 3 copies. One for the lockbox, one for my attorney, one to give her, sealed in a lavender envelope. The day she's ready to understand. 2 weeks passed. Then, another letter. This one from a mediator assigned by the state, requesting a virtual session. Not court, just conversation. I declined, formally, without emotion. Just a simple, no further communication desired. Statement stands, all prior contact documented. Carla took me out to celebrate. We sat at a rooftop bar under heat lamps, sipping drinks and watching the Denver skyline stretch against a purple sky. "You sure you don't want to tell her off, like properly?" she asked. "With all the words you've earned." I laughed. "Words cost energy. Silence is cheaper." She raised her glass. "To the woman who chose herself." I clinked hers. "To the girl who made me." That weekend I cleaned out my closet. Found a box I hadn't opened in years. Inside an old cassette tape. Labeled 1996 Summer Mix. Songs my grandmother used to play in the car. I smiled, slid it into a dusty player, and hit play. The opening chords of Dreams by Fleetwood Mac drifted into the room, and I sat on the floor, letting it wash over me. Not crying. Not angry. Just still, because I wasn't preparing to fight anymore. I had already won. Justice doesn't always wear armor. Sometimes, it just wears boundaries, and holds the line when no one else will. And sometimes it's a daughter watching her mother choose peace over generational pain. The court hearing wasn't dramatic. No shouting. No gasps in the gallery. Just a beige room that smelled faintly of floor polish and printer toner. But my hands were cold the whole time. The kind of cold that doesn't go away with gloves or coffee. It sits under your skin. Old, familiar. Like a shadow you thought you'd already outrun. The petition came through the hospital's legal liaison first. An alert in my inbox. Nancy Saunders had filed a formal claim against me. Emotional and financial abandonment by immediate family. I had to read that line twice. The word abandonment made something ancient curl in my chest. Not rage. Not even grief. Just disbelief. She used the word I spent years scrubbing from my bones. As if she could twist it into something I had done to her. The hearing was set for a Tuesday, 9:00 a.m. sharp. I requested time off. No explanation. Just clicked the submit button with a steadiness I didn't quite feel. That morning, I got up before the alarm, made coffee, burnt toast, skipped breakfast, put on navy slacks, a gray blouse I'd ironed the night before, and shoes that made no sound when I walked. No perfume, no mascara. I didn't want anything on me that wasn't mine. Carla offered to come. So did my manager. Even Leela, who knew something was coming, said, "Do you want me to draw you something for your pocket?" I hugged her so tightly she laughed. "Mom, I'm not sending you into battle." But she was wrong. This was a war. Just a quiet one. And I needed to fight it alone. The courthouse was smaller than I remembered, the chairs too stiff, the ceiling too low, everything too close. Nancy sat 3 rows ahead, to the left, hair perfectly styled, lipstick like armor, wearing the same brand of blazer I used to borrow from her closet, back when I still believed she cared what I wore. She didn't turn around, but I saw the way her fingers tapped her purse handle, the way her foot moved ever so slightly. She was nervous. Good. The judge entered. We all stood. We all sat. Paper shuffled. He read the file slowly, voice dry but focused. Petitioner claims no familial support. States emotional trauma from prolonged estrangement. Seeks formal acknowledgement of obligation or mediation toward future care, related decisions. I felt the courtroom go still. I stared at the wood grain on the table in front of me. Tiny spirals, like questions that never got answered. The judge looked up. "Miss McAdams, you are here in response to this claim. Would you like to address it verbally?" I stood. Every bone in my body was quiet. Every breath deliberate. "No, Your Honor. My written statement is complete." He nodded, paused, and then asked, "Would you like to speak as a daughter?" I opened my mouth. Then closed it, and opened it again. I believe everything that needed to be said was already ignored. Silence. Not just from the room, but from inside me. It was the kind of silence that only comes after years of noise. Nancy turned then. For the first time since I walked in, she met my eyes. Her expression. Calculated. I waited. Would she cry? Would she fake an apology? Would she beg? None of that. She leaned ever so slightly across the aisle and said, low enough for only me to hear, "You always did enjoy the spotlight." And I felt it. The strange, sudden clarity. That this wasn't about justice to her. It wasn't even about money. It was about control. About pulling me back into the story she told herself at night. One where she was the victim, and I was the cold, ungrateful one. The judge's ruling was brief, decisive. No legal obligation exists. The respondent is not required to provide financial or emotional support. The claim is dismissed. That was it. 17 minutes. 3 decades folded and filed. Outside, the air hit me like a baptism. Crisp, thin, cold. The wind lifting strands of my hair like fingers brushing memory. I didn't rush. Didn't cry. Just stood there, feeling my pulse slow. My phone buzzed. A text from Carla. "You good?" I typed back. "Better than good. I'm free." I got home just after 2 p.m. Leela was at the table, earbuds in, drawing again. Her favorite charcoal set scattered across a newspaper. "Hey," she said, looking up. Her face was open. "Safe. You okay?" I nodded. Set my keys down. Kissed her temple. "What are you working on?" She flipped her sketchbook around. 2 women. Back to back. One holding a flame. The other, an open door. My throat caught. She smiled. "It's not finished. I just like the contrast." "It's perfect," I whispered. That night, after she went to bed, I went to mine. But I didn't sleep. I stood barefoot by the window, lights of the neighborhood glowing like quiet hearts. Pulled out the lavender envelope from my dresser. The one marked, Leela, 18 done. I added a new line at the bottom. "You get to choose which stories you carry, and which ones you leave behind." Then I sealed it. For good. I didn't hear from Nancy again. No more letters. No more threats. Just silence. And for the first time in my life, I didn't fill that silence with guilt. Or grief. Or questions. I just let it be. Justice didn't come with applause. It came with an empty inbox. A dismissed claim. A quiet night in my own home. And the steady, certain feeling that the woman she tried to forget had finally remembered herself. Spring in Denver comes quietly. One morning the snow on our porch is still crusted with ice. The next, tulips are pushing through like they've been waiting all winter. I didn't notice them last year. This time, I planted them myself. It was a Saturday. The air smelled like rain on concrete. I was in the front yard, knees in damp soil, Leela beside me, wearing her oldest jeans and a hoodie splattered with paint. She turned to me suddenly and asked, "Did you ever think you'd have a real home?" I looked at our little brick house. The porch light I leave on every night. The chipped mug by the window with her name written in Sharpie. The hallway closet still full of drawings from 2nd grade. "Yes," I said, brushing dirt from my palms. But not until I made one for myself. Closure isn't a ceremony. It's not a gavel drop or a signature. It's a choice you make every day. To stop dragging a weight that never belonged to you. For years, I thought forgiveness was the goal. But I was wrong. Peace is the goal. And you don't need someone's apology to claim it. After the court hearing, things changed. Not all at once, but in layers. The fear didn't vanish. But it shrank. It stopped knocking at 3 a.m. or following me down hospital corridors. Nancy's name stopped echoing when someone said, "Mother." I stopped freezing every time a patient's intake form listed, "Estranged parent." I began living without checking shadows for people who'd already walked away. One afternoon in May, I found an old photo of myself. 15. Taken by a neighbor the summer I started living with my grandmother. I was holding a lemonade, smiling like I wasn't sure if I was allowed to. I stared at that girl for a long time. She didn't know she'd survive. She didn't know she'd raise a daughter who would never question love. She didn't know that one day, she'd walk into a courtroom, face the past, and walk back out whole. I whispered to her, "You made it." And then I put the photo in a frame. Not to forget, but to honor. Leela is turning 14 soon. She asked for an art tablet and a solo night out, just the 2 of us. "Not a party," she said. "Just somewhere quiet." Somewhere I can talk to you and you'll actually listen. I laughed. You think I don't listen? You listen, she said. But you don't always hear. She's right. Kids always are. That night I opened the lavender envelope. The one marked, Lila, 18. I reread the letter. I added 2 more sentences. You are not her story. You're mine. And mine is still being written. There are still days I wonder if Nancy ever tells the truth. To her friends. To herself. To whatever version of me she's built in her mind. But I don't wonder long. Because her story isn't mine anymore. And because now, when I think of mother, I don't think of absence. I think of presence. Of Sunday pancakes. Of wet hair after a bath. Of whispered encouragements before a school presentation. Of Leela curling up on the couch with her feet in my lap, telling me about a dream she had and why she thinks it means she'll become a sculptor. The truest justice is not watching someone fall. It's watching yourself rise. And the best revenge is not a courtroom win. It's a quiet life where you are no longer a victim, not even in your own memory. One morning, a letter arrived. From the same law office as before. This time, unopened. I didn't read it. I didn't need to. I dropped it in the shredder without blinking. Because the only narrative I answer to now is the one I've built with my own hands. Lila's birthday came on a clear, cool evening. She wore the earrings I gave her, small silver crescents. We went to a rooftop cafe, ordered pasta, shared dessert. She handed me a folded drawing, 2 trees growing side by side, roots tangled underneath. At the top, in her handwriting, nothing lost. Just replanted. I didn't cry. I didn't have to. She already understood. When we got home, she lingered in the doorway. I hope I grow up to be like you, she said, kicking off her shoes. I walked over and touched her cheek. You will, I said. And better. Later, I stood alone in the kitchen. Hands wrapped around a warm mug. The lights dim. The house quiet. I didn't think of Nancy. Not in anger. Not in longing. I just let her fade. Like a motel room light finally turned off after too many years left on. If you've ever carried pain that wasn't yours. If you've ever waited for an apology that never came. If you've ever looked at your life and asked, is this all I'll ever be? You are not alone. I was left behind. But I found a way forward. And so will you. If this story found you at the right time, tell me below. What did you choose to carry? And what did you finally let go? Your voice matters more than you know. You are not alone. Every ending can be a new beginning. Subscribe to EN Reddit Story for more real stories of quiet justice, healing, and emotional legacy after 40.